Welcome to The Conspiracy Show. I'm Richard Syrett. Monday, December 8th, 1980. I was at a friend's house. We were watching Monday Night Football, but we had the sound on the TV turned down because we were listening to records. We'd only recently discovered the Beatles. So I went home that night not knowing that Howard Cosell had just announced to the world that John Lennon had been shot and killed outside his New York apartment. The world was told Lennon was murdered by a crazed fan looking for attention, and many of us believed that version of events. For me and millions, Lennon's death meant the end of a selfish dream. Now the Beatles could never reform. Of course, Yoko Ono had lost a devoted husband, and Sean and Julian had lost a father. It was only years later I also came to appreciate Lennon's other contribution, lending his voice to civil rights, peace, and equality. On this episode of The Conspiracy Show, we'll meet investigators and researchers who conclude Lennon was targeted for assassination because his commitment to nonviolence and peace made him a very, very dangerous person. We're about to find out who may have wanted him dead and how they did it. We'll also hear evidence to suggest David Chapman was anything but a crazed and delusional fan seeking attention, but rather another in a long line of programmed assassins, a Manchurian candidate. And of course, our skeptic will weigh in and strongly suggest that Lennon's tragic death was merely a result of celebrity meets bad man with gun. Me? Just give me some truth. I'll follow it wherever it leads. It is time to redefine reality. Genetic enigma or a human alien hybrid?
That's how cynical I am now about the process.
Mainstream media,
technology,
alter weather patterns
created by the corporation.
Has been engineered by the Illuminati.
John Lennon was murdered because he decided to become a whistleblower. The music was really written by Lennon, but then it was completely mastered and changed by computers at Tavistock, so that like Muzak, which has a desired effect to get you to shop in the stores, this gives you a desired effect to want to involve in and take drugs.
According to Nelson Thal and his mentor, the late Marshall McLuhan, the Beatles were created as a psychological warfare weapon at the Tavistock Institute in London, England. Tavistock has long been known as the precursor of the infamous CIA MK-Ultra mind control program. What was the purpose then of the Beatles in America?
What was happening at that time in 1964 was the Warren Commission inquiry was about to come out. America's attention was on a coup d'etat and the murder of the president. It was very important to kickstart the American consciousness away from understanding and learning about what really happened in Dallas. The British invasion, as we call it, was brought in to distract America's mind away from the Kennedy assassination report and to bring in the drugs, weapons of mass control, so you can stop thought, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
There are many people who look at LSD in America and think that LSD was primarily an American invention. They have this sort of colloquial belief that everything is somehow an American invention. But it was really the British that brought LSD to the United States. There seems to have been a reason behind this tremendous attention that America was being given by the British, whether it was the Beatles or other British invasion type bands. And the focus of the music, whether it started that way or not, was really towards the psychedelic. So in a sense, the Beatles themselves were, again, just a small fragment of what might have been a much larger entity.
One of the things that came out of that was the whole psychedelic movement, the infusion of LSD, which the CIA was a major player in. The nation had just suffered this psychic trauma with the Kennedy assassination and the British invasion. The Beatles came in, they were on Ed Sullivan. I remember seeing that there was like a positive feeling throughout the country, hope and promise that perhaps things were going to be better or moving in a new and positive direction with this British invasion.
Just as the Beatles were at the pinnacle of their success, tragedy struck. On August 27, 1967, their longtime manager, Brian Epstein, was found dead in London of an apparent accidental overdose. However, media scientist Nelson Thal is convinced Epstein's death was no accident.
Well, he was suicided. His ability to manipulate them had come to an end, and so he knew too much and he had to be taken out of the way.
Why did McCartney suddenly take off for Scotland and John Lennon took off for Amsterdam as if they were running for their lives?
Yeah, I think they really were running for their lives. I think that they also realized at that time that if this was something that they were involved with that had this kind of level of danger, that they were responding to it in the only way that they knew how. And so they basically just pulled up stakes and left.
Yeah, it seems like after that meeting with McLuhan, the musical direction changed with Lennon. The focus of his music shifted and he became much more politically active.
In December of 1969, John and Yoko visited Toronto as part of their peace campaign. During their visit, Lennon traveled to the University of Toronto, where he met with Canadian philosopher of communications theory, Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan's work is viewed as one of the cornerstones of the study of media theory, but Marshall McLuhan also believed in conspiracies.
What Lennon's meeting with McLuhan may have precipitated was the next step that Lennon took. Marshall McLuhan, who was basically the dawn of the intelligentsia at the University of Toronto, would hold court in the coach house. John Lennon walks in, and apparently he says to John Lennon, "Do you know you're a useful fool?"
Marshall McLuhan, of course, told John Lennon that he had been a student and involved backstage in the secret societies. McLuhan pointed out that the arts and sciences were in the pockets of the secret societies.
How was McLuhan's message to Lennon received by Lennon?
Lennon left the meeting in a huff and a puff and refused to believe it. Of course, he came back a few days later with his tail between his legs and realized that McLuhan had put together the dots in his life and shown him a pattern that he hadn't previously seen, and now he was pretty upset as to how he had been abused.
Yeah, it seems like after that meeting with McLuhan, the musical direction changed with Lennon. The focus of his music shifted and he became much more politically active.
Of all the conspiracy theories that revolve around people faking their death or people being killed by the government, stars, I'm thinking, Elvis, Marilyn Monroe, John Lennon, all those stories, John Lennon's has the most probability to it. He was clearly someone of influence to an enormous population that the government at the time didn't really understand. From the point at which he moved to the United States, and even before, the Beatles had such a huge influence over the youth of America that I can see why government might have been interested in having a closer look at what he was preaching to them, the influences of his music, the drug culture that he seemed to be promoting, all that stuff. I get all that. But let's face it, in terms of the effect that it had on the people that he was playing to, that were buying his records, I don't see it. People grew their hair long. People, maybe smoked an extra joint on a Friday night after listening to the Beatles. Certainly, I'm not trying to downplay the influence of them, but they weren't a force for, radical things. Charles Manson notwithstanding.
He was surrounded at all times by the intelligence agencies. I don't know that he was able to discern who was who, but I'm sure he felt that the British were very much involved.
He was definitely being watched and was not only being watched, but the people who were watching him guarded him as well.
During that period, Lennon claimed that he was under surveillance. He felt like his wires were tapped. Some people They said, you're being paranoid about this.
He knew his phones were being wiretapped. He said he couldn't understand why the phones in New York City were not working because there were always guys in fixing the phones. His life in New York was very, very uncomfortable.
Lennon's supposed killer, Mark David Chapman, was immediately portrayed by the New York City police and the media as mentally imbalanced, an obsessed fan who became disillusioned with the former Beatle. In his book, God Code Peace, author Pepper Chomsky pieces together an entirely different picture of Chapman.
We know that Mark David Chapman was very, very involved with the drug culture.
During the 70s, Mark David Chapman was employed by the YMCA. The YMCA, in many cases, it's been shown, has worked as a front operation for the CIA.
Okay, well, history tells us that Mark David Chapman went to Beirut, and it was part of a YMCA program.
The YMCA sent Chapman all around the world, to Vietnam, for instance, and Beirut, where he received training as a security guard.
Is the suggestion here that he wasn't really at the YMCA camp? He was being brainwashed, perhaps programmed to be an assassin?
You know, Mark David Chapman was not staying in a hostel in downtown Beirut, and Shamlan was considered as a spy school for the British.
So there's this specter of spookiness around Mark David Chapman.
Catcher in the Rye has historically been used as a post-hypnotic suggestion, the trigger to get them to go into action.
Mark David Chapman made no attempt to escape. His mission, his crusade, his attitude, his mental attitude was such that he was very satisfied with the job that he did. He had no interest in escaping.
Arthur O'Connor was the lieutenant with the New York Police Department's 20th Precinct. They were the ones that were conducting the investigation into Lennon's murder. Let me read you a quote, and he was interviewed by British author Fenton Bresler. Arthur O'Connor said, "As far as you are trying to build up some kind of a conspiracy, I would support you in that line. Like I said originally over the phone, if this gentleman Chapman wanted to get away with it, he could have walked away." Again, he sat down, he started reading from Catcher in the Rye, waiting to be apprehended.
He could have walked away. I mean, you would think that, you know, I think virtually anybody that picks up a gun and shoots people has some form of mental illness somewhere. I mean, it's not a rational thing to do. I don't think he was thinking beyond after firing the gun, what was going to happen.
The people who saw him were all leading experts. The psychiatrists who were involved with Mark David Chapman, they were completely baffled by him.
Classic mind control, just like a Manchurian candidate that was sent to assassinate Reagan. It came out of the same group, ruling elite assassination teams that killed Lennon.
But the idea that Chapman was a Manchurian candidate, I think, is bunk. I just don't buy it. I've read a lot of the conspiracy theory material that goes along with it, and it just doesn't have a ring of truth to me.
Well, we do know that the CIA has admitted on the record that they did conduct experiments into mind control. We have Project Artichoke, we have MK Ultra, we have psychologists, people like Michael Klein from New York, who say it is possible to hypnotize and brainwash someone to do something they wouldn't ordinarily do, like kill someone.
No, it's possible. It's possible. I mean, I think that you have to have what hypnotists, the amazing Ravine and people, stage hypnotists, always say, I can't make you do anything that you wouldn't do normally. And, you know, Chapman doesn't strike me as that guy.
The attempted assassination on Ronald Reagan was perpetrated by John Hinckley. They later found in John Hinckley's possession the book The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Now, when Mark David Chapman was apprehended, leaning up against the Dakota building, reading The Catcher in the Rye, What this suggested to me was that the catcher in the rye was used as a mechanism of control, basically to trigger a post-hypnotic command.
Many of the Manchurian candidates have post-hypnotic suggestions to trigger them to go into the act. Catcher in the Rye has historically been used by the British intelligence in Tavistock as a post-hypnotic, in the 50s and 60s it was, early on, the post-hypnotic suggestion, the trigger to get them to go into action.
You have a deeply troubled person, and ultimately I think that he was someone who felt that he was a nobody and wanted to become a somebody, and he chose a despicable, tragic route to becoming that person. Someone who chose a tragic, horrible way to assert themselves in a world where they feel like they have no control.
Lennon told Paul Krasner, the editor of The Realist, if something happens to me, it wasn't an accident.
When Mark David Chapman was arrested and he was first offered legal defense, his plea was not guilty. And then he decided he heard the voice of God and he changed his plea to guilty. Within a moment, any opportunity that one might have had to investigate the murder of John Lennon disappears.
Here's what John's son, John Lennon, said about his dad's assassination in 1998. He was a countercultural revolutionary, and the government takes that shit really seriously. He was dangerous to the government. These pacifist revolutionaries are historically killed by the government, and anybody who thinks Mark David Chapman was just some crazy guy who killed my dad for his personal interests is insane, or hasn't thought about it clearly.
Pacifist or revolutionary, I think, stretches the credulity a little bit, in the sense that, the bed-ins for peace, I'm not sure how much real effect any of that had. And I think John Lennon probably, with his 300-page dossier put together by the FBI in working with the CIA, I don't think that that was enough for them to go, we're going to pluck someone out of obscurity. We're going to find the 1 in 1 million person that we can hypnotize and make them do something that they would never normally do. We're going to find that person. We're going to look all across the United States. Okay, we found that guy in Hawaii. We had to look really far, but we found that guy in Hawaii. We're going to take him underground. We're going to train him. We're going to hypnotize him. We're going to send him to New York. We're going to get him to kill a beetle for us. To me, it stretches the limits of, I think, what is reasonable. I think that you have a deeply disturbed guy working by himself, who, probably, I would imagine, loves the idea that people think that he was a government operative.
So is the Tavistock Institute or other intelligence groups still involved in this game of co-opting rock groups and co-opting their music for these nefarious purposes of mind control?
The music now is just a tribal drum beat, and it's not necessary to deceive the masses and rule the masses with the suggestive music. Now they just use the invisible powers of the air through the cell phones.
Lennon told Paul Krasner, the editor of The Realist, if something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Years later, all these FBI documents came out showing that Lennon had been surveilled by the Nixon administration, and their pretext was a marijuana bust, but the real intent behind that was because he was an anti-war advocate. And there was this fear of the rock stars during that period had a lot of influence, and especially afraid about the ones who could bring masses of people together, much like Woodstock at a moment's notice.
British intelligence had very, very similar files that the FBI had on John Lennon. And so one would suspect that they were working together, and that the information that was being supplied to the FBI and the information that was being supplied to British intelligence was being handed back and forth fairly openly.
We know the CIA and FBI constantly surveil John Lennon. He was considered a subversive and a radical. We know the CIA takes subversives very seriously. Today, we know the president has the power to order U.S. citizens to be assassinated without due process. And we know the FBI had a 300-page file on Lennon. Much of it remains classified for national security reasons. The doorman at the Dakota that night was Jose Perdomo, a veteran of the CIA's botched Bay of Pigs invasion, a professional hitman who worked closely with convicted Watergate burglar Frank Sturgis on the CIA's payroll. Now, none of this conclusively proves Lennon was assassinated by the CIA or MI6 or that Chapman was a Manchurian candidate. It's never that easy. We have to dig way down, deeper than Anderson Cooper has ever been, deeper, where few of us are willing to go. That's where the truth lies, and that's where it will likely stay. Because as Lennon himself penned in Strawberry Fields Forever, living is easy with eyes closed. And now, I'd like to know what you think. Get in touch with me through the website, theconspiracyshow.com. In the meantime, don't be afraid.